Hello, welcome back. It's time for another chapter of The Skylark Song by J.M. Frey. If you're enjoying this story and would like a copy of your very own, you can head to www.jmfrey.net/books and you'll be able to find a copy of the book there, along with its sequel, The Skylark's Sacrifice. All right, Chapter 5. Al was leaning against the wall beside the gates when Robin left the base. He didn't blend into the shadows at all. Stealth had never been his strong suit. Robin stopped, not surprised, but not sure how to tell him what had happened. "Holmans, Robin, are you in one piece? They said it was the Coyote, that running coal bag, and I was scared stupid," he said, shoving into the light to wrap his meaty arms around her shoulders. He squeezed so hard Robin's feet left the ground. "How can you tell if you were scared stupid? Can you get any dumber?" Robin teased, but she leaned her head against his neck, grateful for his warmth and his concern. "Har har," Al replied, and set her down. He stepped back, cataloging her at arm's length. "Is everything where it should be?" Not on Wade, Robin thought, but she couldn't bring herself to say it out loud. Robin knew the kind of picture she must have made. Her new goggles were perched high on her forehead, keeping her hair back, if not contained. The escaping hairs around her face had been tickling at her eyebrows and cheeks since they landed, and the adrenaline and shock had worn off enough for her to notice them. They were annoying and too short to do anything about without the full use of her hands, which were swathed now in fresh white bandages. The general had said nothing when she'd used her new captain's goggles as a substitute hairband, and Robin was grateful for that. She'd removed her equally new capelet as soon as she was outside the general's office, and had folded it carefully to keep it from creasing. Now it was bundled up under her arm, buttons shining in the lamplight. She curled her body around it, trying to hide it from view. Al saw it anyway, and for a second Robin hoped he wouldn't recognize it. It was a stupid hope. "Is that yours?" he asked, eyes wide and mouth slack with shock. "Holy omens, Robin. Did they promote you?" "No!" Robin denied, and then rolled her eyes at her own vehement lie. "Yes." Al took another step back, and Robin kept herself from pushing forward into his embrace, into the warmth and surety and support of friendship that she needed so much right now. "Al, please, don't be mad." I'm not mad," Al spat. I don't understand. One of us? A pilot?" "I couldn't say no," Robin said. The pay increase, the station. Al, I'll be an officer." Al's nose scrunched up. "No," Robin insisted before he could say it. Now she did take a step forward. She got up in Al's face and bared her teeth at him. "You know me better than that, Alistair Brigid. I will not turn into a scrubbed-up snob just because they ask me to sit in a different part of the glider. Don't be an ass." "I'm not being an ass," Al said back, but he still turned his back to her, his whole posture slumped, wounded. "Don't make me feel bad about this. I'm scared too, all right? But I'm proud that I've proved myself worthy of promotion. Proud to be a Sealy good enough to rise above the restrictions they push on us, and proud that I have the skills that the Air Patrol wants. Can't you just be happy for me? Please?" Robin leaned her forehead against his back, headbutting his shoulder blade lightly. "Come on, Al. Don't do this to me. Not now. Not when I need someone on my side." He turned, and one of his thick arms wrapped around her shoulders.
"Don't give up when you're down.
Al held up the
Fly as long as you can. Sing your song in the sky while you're passing by your challenges airship. War is raging everywhere, mostly when you're gliding in the air. A silly girl lost in the Klonn land is being the Coyote hand down behind the lines. Wings fighting over consequence.
Robin took a step and stopped Robin.
Struggle with mixed feelings, and you sing the Skylark song. You long for the place you belong, but your heart beats for the unknown. Skylark song, Skylark thin, bright and strong. Skylark song, winds and steams mid-flight, pilot prey. The war is over today. Winds and steams mid-flight, pilot prey. The war is over today.
Not out of the air patrol altogether because it's the only way to keep them ordering pirates could do, he said, sniffing once and rubbing his flat nose with the back of his grease-stained hand. Oh, sure. And then what? Get married, have some kids, be content to wait for the next bomb to fall on my house? No, thanks. Al lowered his eyes, mumbled a goodbye, and was lost to the shadows beyond the street lamps so quickly Robin wondered if he'd learned some woodland god's vanishing trick. She had no doubts that the pot of mead would be empty before he got home. Sighing, Robin turned and let herself inside. Once there, she unrolled the fawn brown leather capelet with its gold braid trim and highly polished brass buttons and hung it from the tree in the hall. Then she joined her parents in the parlor. She decided to simply say nothing, to let her appearance speak for itself. It was the coward's way, sure, but this was not the sky. Robin could be a coward here in the safety of her own home. Papa looked up from his newspaper, which was so scraggly and creased that he clearly brought it home from work after many other people had already read it. Robin handed Mama the bonus pay packet. She took it, caught sight of Robin's bandaged hands, and started crying, soft and silent, tears falling into the mending she had cradled in her lap. When Papa realized why, he didn't shout or rage. He just took Mama's hands between his own, comforting, and kissed her on the forehead. Then her lips. Then he raised her left hand to his mouth and kissed the thin diagonal scar that ran across her palm, her marriage line. Papa had an identical one on his own left hand, where they had been bound together by the wise women on their wedding day. Robin ran her fingers over the bandages that crisscrossed her hands. Pilot scars would get in the way of anyone being able to see Robin's marriage line when it was her turn, if it was ever her turn. Nurse churned in her empty stomach as Robin reported to the officers' mess in the morning. She paused just long enough in the hallway to slip her goggles on, letting them hang around her neck, and to shake out and then swing the capelet over her shoulders, covering the shirt her mother had spent the night scrubbing back into a semblance of its original cream color. Mama had also scrubbed Robin's hair clean and had plaited it tightly into a rigid braid that reached nearly to the small of her back. Beeswax from the hive in the garden had been smoothed across her scalp to keep the flyaways regimented into a semblance of control. Robin's scalp still ached from Mama's vigorous fingers, and her ears hurt from the tightness of her hair. She spent the whole walk to the base wiggling her eyebrows in an attempt to loosen the pull, without destroying Mama's hard work. Tugging the capelet into position one last time, Robin took a deep, centering breath and, without knocking, went inside. The room was maybe half the size of the canteen hangar, close and as cozy as it could be made on a base. It was filled with small round tables and stuffed, mismatched chairs that were nonetheless more comfortable looking than the wide, dented copper benches Robin had sat on every morning for the last 6 years. There were maybe a dozen tables pressed in around the long credenza on the back wall, and 3 times as many officers as that mingling around, arranging their breakfasts and curling over wrinkled, well-marked topographical maps. She was greeted with the halloos of a room full of Bene officers who all stood when she came in. The wall of noise was startling and unexpected. Robin froze in the doorway as if a night watchman at a factory had caught her thieving, knife already in his hand. Then a brawny lieutenant colonel wearing the most ridiculous of fanciful mustaches crowded up beside her, grabbed her elbow, and pulled her into the center of the cozy lounge that made up the mess. All her blood seemed to rush into her head, abandoning her feet as they stumbled along the high pile of thick rugs. Her boots, polished to as high a shine as possible but still scuffed and cracked with age, snagged on the plushed carpet. Everything inside of her went shivery when a fellow captain clapped her on the shoulders and boomed, "Well done, well done! Gave that monster what for, you did? About time one of us sent him off with his tailpipes between his legs." Well, that was Captain Perwink, who, "You saved his life," another captain cried, raising a cup of tea as though it was a beer stein. Robin twisted out from under the lieutenant colonel's scarred paw and took a step back from the claustrophobic press of the officers who had decided to welcome her. There was a distinct divide between them and the rest of the Bene, who lined the walls with narrowed eyes and crossed arms. Robin stood her ground firmly in the no-man's land between them. Not a three-way warm my arse, Robin thought. She and Wade had often argued over the class divide that turned the two-sided conflict with the Klonn into a three-sided conflict no one acknowledged. A pang of worry stabbed through her, and she wondered how Wade fared. Had his wound become infected? Was he out of danger, or still fighting? "Captain," the lieutenant colonel said, gathering her attention. He held up something small and round and green, a medal of valor. The frontispiece was stamped with the dual outstretched wings of the air patrol, the Bene symbol for courage, the hollow circle that represented the All-Mother's all-encompassing embrace nestled between them. "What?" Robin said, flummoxed and confused. She watched the lieutenant colonel pin it over her heart on the capelet, crunching her chin down even as her eyebrows rose. "No, wait, I didn't do anything special." "Nonsense," he blustered as he fixed the button in place with fingers thick like sausages. Frustration curled in Robin's guts. There was little more annoying than a superior officer who talked over you. One of the displeased officers along the wall strode forward to slap something into the lieutenant colonel's hand when he held it out, palm up, pilot scars on proud display. He deftly flipped the little objects in his grip and then pinned them in place as well. 2 brass rank pins were now secured to the front of Robin's capelet, on either side of the stiff, short collar. They were a pair of stylized open wings that spread across her collarbone, announcing her to the world as the captain of a glider. She breathed heavily through her nose and thought of the sky and the breeze and of not falling over in a dead faint. Half the room burst into uproarious and perhaps a bit too forced applause. The rest tapped their palms on their thighs politely, and then immediately went back to their tea and their plans. The cheers rang off the metal walls of the room and clanged discordantly in Robin's ears. Pomp and faff done, the lieutenant colonel tugged an envelope from his breast pocket under his own battered and wear-soft capelet and handed it over. Then he saluted the room and strode out the door, his stride long and his gait confident. Feeling foolish and still standing in the middle of everything like an awkward cat, Robin opened the envelope. Inside was another pair of wings for her leather waistcoat, so her rank would be clear even when she wasn't wearing the capelet, and her commissioning papers. "This is really happening," she thought. "That's my name, and that's the seal of King Auden. They must be completely daft, or very, very desperate. They really want to reward me for sheer stupid good luck." Then, suddenly, someone smacked her shoulder. Robin stumbled and whirled around, jaw and fists clenched, ready for a fight, only to realize that it hadn't been a blow, it'd been a congratulations. Someone else patted her shoulder, and then another, and Robin stood still and let them rain down soft blows on her back and shoulders. "Normally we shake hands," one of the pilots who decided to not hate Robin, at least not openly, said, cozying up beside her. The woman had her hair pulled up in a severe, glossy red bun, smooth and honestly a bit intimidating. But her face bore the ruddy marks the fair-skinned among the pilots all got on their cheeks, where the pale line of their goggles ended and the sunburn began. Wade had them, too. "But not until your calluses come in." She handed Robin a small jar of salve with such grave solemnity that Robin might have been concerned had not the pilots around her burst into raucous laughter the minute it was in her bandaged hand. Some sort of hazing ritual, maybe? Robin guessed. Now, breakfast? She gestured flippantly at the overburdened credenza against the wall. There was more food on those platters than Robin had seen at home in 2 months, and now that her attention was on it, Robin could smell it. Roasted meats, fresh fruit, and fresh-baked bread. Gods! Her stomach yowled, and the pilot beside her laughed and nudged her gently towards the spread. Torn between the superior offerings of the officer's breakfast and her desire to be with Al in some place more familiar, Robin found herself stuck, unable to take a step. What would the rest of the Sealies say, she wondered, if she walked into the common canteen in her pilot's uniform and sat down with them? She was going to have to find out sooner or later. Eventually, she called herself a coward and sucked up the courage to approach the small, terrifyingly civil breakfast buffet. She had survived a dance with a coyote. She could damn well survive going over to that table and talking to her fellow captains, Bene or not. They had congratulated her in front of their commanding officer, but now that the lieutenant colonel had left, presumably to take his breakfast with officers of his own rank, would she find her reception sedated? Robin swallowed hard. She hadn't spoken to many Bene besides Wade, and she had no idea if they would accept a Seelie among their ranks. The woman who had given Robin the jar of salve jumped into line behind her, and Robin offered her a strained smile. She returned it with one of her own, lighter and more free, and Robin felt something in her chest unclench. "I'm Captain Renge, by the way," the woman said. "Catherine Renge. Robin Arianhod." "Yes, I know." "Oh, right. Of course." Awkward silence descended as they each picked up the utensils and a plate. The line moved forward slightly, and Robin clutched at the heavy knife and fork, unwilling to reach forward to snag the first of the food from the serving trays and baskets, as she would have in the common canteen. Patience, she told herself. Robin was nothing, if not good, at being patient. "Tea?" Renge asked as she poured some without waiting for Robin's answer. She used a china cup, far too delicate for service in the common canteen, and Robin suddenly felt homesick for the dented, cheap metal dishes she had known for most of her life. Without asking, the woman dolloped sugar into the tea, and then handed it to Robin. Thanks." Robin balanced it on her plate and stared into its grainy depths, trying not to pull a face. "Something wrong?" Renge asked. Clearly, Robin hadn't succeeded. She said and shook her head. Then she nodded. She could do this. "No honey?" Renge blinked. The warmth of her expression evaporated, leaving tawny eyebrows that rose upward and light eyes that narrowed underneath. "You'd actually prefer honey to sugar?" "Yes," Robin said, and stood up straighter, refusing to be cowed because, damn it, everyone bloody well knew that Sealies couldn't afford to buy refined sugar. I'm just used to it, that's all." Renge said. She took the tea from Robin's plate and placed it on her own, then deftly poured a second cup, which she then placed, significantly less carefully, back in Robin's hand. Tea sloshed over the side and scalded Robin's knuckles, seeped into the backs of her bandages, but she didn't drop the cup. Mostly because she refused to be intimidated, but also because she didn't want the cost of the pricey china coming off her next pay. With a lazy, dismissive gesture, Renge sent a boy in a server's uniform running to the kitchen for some honey. "Guess we'll have to keep honey in here from now on. I suppose you can remove the tick from the fur, but you can't, well..." She said it with a sneer, and the man standing directly behind her chuckled. A few other sniggers were heard around the room, but they were thankfully among the minority of people, and mostly muffled against hands or cups. Robin's shoulders ratcheted up again, and she bit down hard on her tongue. The line moved forward, and Robin forced herself to smile and say, "Thank you, that's very kind of you," to the woman before she turned her back and advanced. Robin filled her plate with all sorts of things she'd never had before. Flaky breakfast pastries, sweet peanut preserves, something she highly suspected was creamed chocolate, and so much fresh fruit she wondered if she could actually eat it all. Just as she reached the end of the table, the serving boy returned with the honey. The little tarnished pot was freshly opened, with a delicate silver spoon perched beside it. The fine china dish and ridiculous paper doily it sat on made it look even more dented, overused, and silly. Robin suddenly felt very much like that honey pot. She stopped deliberately, and in plain view of the others, to spoon a little honey into her tea, and the boy, his back to the Bene pilots in line, grinned at her, his dark eyes sparkling in his flushed face. "Thank you, Mr. she said to the boy, and he was so surprised and pleased to be thanked that he nearly shouted his reply. "Seti, Captain! Bill Seti!" He lifted his palm up to the gods to thank her for asking, and she repeated the gesture to thank him for giving it to her. "Thank you, Mr. Seti," Robin said out loud, slowly and clearly and deliberately. She hadn't heard any of the other officers thank the boy. "Is it possible to be sure there's honey every morning?" "Absolutely, Captain," Bill said, and grinned a grin fit to split open his face. Then he composed his features, ducked his head slightly, and returned to his place beside the table, servile and proper once more. Demonstratively, she set the pot of honey down between the tea carafes and the sugar dish. Somebody in the rear of the line grumbled, but Robin lifted her chin and turned away. She found an unoccupied table in a corner and proceeded to pack half her bounty away in her cloth napkin. She also wrapped a choice piece of chocolate in an old waybill she found in her pocket. It would be good for buying charms. Then she set to the remainder with gusto. The bacon was still warm, the tea was a bit weak for Robin's liking, but otherwise the meal was fantastic. The pastry left buttery smears on her hands, and, having no napkin anymore, Robin had to wipe them discreetly on the shirt under her leather vest, where nobody would see the stains. No one came to sit beside her, but Robin didn't give a God's good ass. She wasn't here to make friends. She was here to pilot a glider and to shoot down Klonn airships. She was here because she owed the Coyote for Wade's shoulder. And if the Bene prigs in pilots' uniforms had a problem with that, they could go hang. She had been promoted, so somebody in command thought her worth investing time and extra training in, felt she was worth trusting a glider to, and in the end, it was only their opinion that mattered. Still, when she had finished eating, Robin lifted her bandaged palms to the sky, closed her eyes, and whispered her prayer of thanks for the meal as quietly as she could. Wade was still asleep when Robin stopped by the infirmary later. The medic pulled her aside before she went into his room and said, with a dour face, "I want you to be warned, Captain. His shoulder was, well, it was bad. About as bad as it could be. They couldn't save his arm." "His whole arm?" Robin gasped. "By the gods." The Bene medic sniffed at her oath, but let her in the room, all the same. Robin left one of the pastries she'd pilfered by the water glass on his bedside table, then forced herself to look at her former pilot and friend. His chest and shoulder were swathed with thick pads and crisp white bandages, but there was nothing past that lump of fabric. She touched the bandages over his shoulder briefly, lightly, and tried not to stare at the miserable line of his mouth, at the dark shadows under his eyes. The medic, who had been silently studying a stack of papers in the corner of the room, shook his head sadly when Robin asked if Wade had awakened yet. "Thank you," Robin said, when what she really wanted to howl was, "It's not fair! The two of us survived to dance with the Coyote, and this is how the gods repay that valor?" Instead, she bobbed a polite nod at the medic and ducked out. Her stomach was in knots, her breakfast sitting too high in her sternum, and the backs of her eyes burned as she left the room. Her next stop was at the canteen, the napkin of treats clutched in nervous fingers. Robin hesitated in the open door, scanning the crowd for Al, fidgeting with the bottom hem of the capelet. She'd considered not wearing it, going back and forth with herself over whether it would look like she was trying to hide something that everyone else on the base already knew, or whether it would look like she was gloating. In the end, she decided to just leave it on. Like ripping off a bandage stuck to the skin with blood, the pain would be more intense, but over quicker. She found Al seated at the very end of the back row, staring at the dingy metal wall, rolling his metal teacup between his hands. Needing time to firm up her resolve, Robin crossed the room in the opposite direction, going for the breakfast line. She wanted tea, wanted the faint, familiar, metallic taste of the cup in her hand, the honey-thick, bitter brew on her tongue when she spoke to Al. Though she kind of felt bad, going to breakfast tea again after she'd had as much as she wanted in the officers' lounge. The line parted before her. The mid-flights that had been sneering at her just yesterday did a double take and then, with wide eyes, stepped back and let Robin prepare herself a cup. Robin tried to gesture for them to go first, but they just shook their heads and refused to move until she had. Mortified, she prepared her cup quickly, tongue like a shriveled grape behind her teeth, and slouched along the outer wall. She felt eyes boring into her back like needles, and hated the stupid goggles perched on her forehead, the way the pilots did, hated the ostentatious capelet. She hated that something that was good, something that she was supposed to be proud of, made her little more than an outsider, no matter where she was. A tarnished pot of cheap honey on a china saucer and paper doily. When she reached Al's table, Robin hesitated, standing across from him with her steaming tea in one hand and the bundled napkin in the other. Al had to know she was there, had to have at least glanced up when the whispers around the room had started, but he just sat there, just stared at the wall and kept rolling the cup between his whole, forge-calloused palms. Robin put the napkin down in front of him as a peace offering. Al sniffed once, no doubt catching the rising scent from the warm butter pastries, and slid his eyes to the napkin. Then he lifted them higher, pausing at the capelet, tracing the fall of each gold braid, the curve of each round brass button, the cream-colored trim, the small moss-green metal, the stretch of the brass rank pins. Finally, he looked up at Robin, his brown gaze jumping briefly up to the sparkling amber lenses of her freshly polished goggles, then back down to her face. "Omens," he said, and reached out to tug apart the knot that held the napkin closed. "You didn't turn it down, eh? Now how am I supposed to stare at your boobs, Robin threw back her head and laughed. It felt absurdly good, and it made every pair of eyes in the room turn to stare, trying, of course, to look like they weren't. It would be rude to stare openly at a superior officer. Robin didn't care, though. She really didn't. Wade was alive, even if he hadn't woken up yet, even if he didn't know yet all that he'd lost. She had been promoted, and her best friend wasn't angry anymore. Everyone else, Bene and Celie alike, could go throw themselves in a frozen lake. She sat down across from Al and sipped her tea. She trod affectionately on his toes with the hard heel of her boot. "So, a captain, eh?" Al said, mouthful of butter pastry and a blissful expression on his brick wall face. "They must be desperate to be promoting, one of us." Al let an amused snort rip. "Or maybe you're just that good, Robin." Robin felt her cheeks get hot, the flush flagging across her nose. "Maybe," she said, but it wasn't really in agreement. "I have to spend all afternoon learning to shoot, and later there'll be flight training and stuff." She fished the envelope out of the capelet's inner pocket and showed Al the letters. "You didn't crash the glider," Al said, setting aside the pastry to rifle through her commissioning papers. "That's a big bonus for them." Robin smacked his shoulder half-heartedly. It felt good to be doing something familiar, to see the usual theatrical grimace on Al's face, and to feel the surge of friendly annoyance. Al raised his hand to shove her shoulder, but stopped when his palm touched the smooth, fresh, dough-brown leather. He patted it once with his fingers, and then pulled them away awkwardly, jamming his hands between his thighs under the table. His touch left behind a dull patina of ash and soot and engine grease, the signature that forged drones left on everything. He cut his eyes to the stain, and then down again to his trapped hands. Robin sighed. Right. Well, maybe not exactly the way things were. And that's chapter 5. Thank you very much for spending time with me, and I'll see you in the video for chapter 6.
Give up when you're down. Fly as long as you can.